Hello everyone, I love you and I hope you're all having a wonderful week. Today I'd like to talk about storms. And when we think about storms, we often think about natural storms like hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. But the truth is we all experience storms in our personal lives too. Storms are those times of struggle and adversity and darkness in our lives. Storms are the major problems that we face, and they can occur in our relationships, our health, our finances, our families, and our careers. And oftentimes we find ourselves struggling and facing multiple storms at the same time. And we know that storms are dangerous because they can discourage us and overwhelm us. They can hit us when we least expect it and cause us to take our eyes off of God and put them on our circumstances instead. And since we know that storms are dangerous and that we will have to face storms at some point in our life, we need to understand storms and learn how to best deal with them. And we can learn a lot of lessons about storms by observing how Jesus encounters and calms a storm on the sea. And that's found in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. And I'll read those for us now. On that day when evening had come, he told them, "Let's cross over to the other side of the sea." So they left the crowd and took him along since he was in the boat, and other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. He was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. So they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Silence, be still." The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Then he told them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked one another, "Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." So let's see what we can learn about storms from this passage. And the first thing we can learn is this: following Jesus does not guarantee smooth sailing. Following Jesus does not guarantee smooth sailing. We see that the disciples left the safety of the shore. They left their comfort zone and went onto the sea following Jesus. And we see that even though they did what Jesus told them, they still experienced a dangerous and violent storm. And a lot of times when we become Christians, we think that if we follow Jesus, that our lives will just magically become perfect, that we'll have no problems, everything will go right for us, we'll get everything we want, nothing will be wrong, that everything will be easy and comfortable. There'll be no pain, no problems, no struggling. We think we'll just have a perfect life. But that's not true. Jesus never promises us a perfect life when we follow him. Jesus never says that following him will be easy. And just because we're Christians does not mean that we will never experience storms, because storms are inevitable. Everyone faces them. And so we should learn to expect storms instead of being surprised by them. 1 Peter 4, verse 12 says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised when the fiery ordeal comes among you to test you as if something unusual were happening to you." So even as Christians, we should expect storms in our lives. But since we are Christians, even though we still have to go through storms, we are better able to handle them and deal with them because we have Jesus in our boat. Jesus will help us handle the storm, and he will calm the storms of our lives. And so we have to understand that following Jesus does not guarantee smooth sailing. Second, we see that storms are sometimes the result of obedience. The disciples did nothing wrong. They followed Jesus and were very obedient to him, but yet they still had to experience a storm. And a lot of times we think that as long as we're in the will of God and we're following him and obeying him, that we'll never experience a storm. But that's not true. And so we often think that storms, when we face storms in our life, it's always because we've done something wrong. We have sinned or made wrong choices or bad choices, and we're paying the consequences by having to go through a storm. And oftentimes that is true. A lot of storms in our life are brought on by our sin and our own bad choices. But then there's sometimes when a storm could be a result of obedience. Sometimes Jesus will lead us into a storm for whatever reason he has, and oftentimes we don't understand why. At the time, or maybe ever, we may never understand why. but sometimes Jesus will lead us through a storm. So not all storms are caused by disobedience. Just because you're experiencing a storm doesn't necessarily mean you've disobeyed Jesus. Third, we see that the presence of storms does not mean the absence of God. The presence of storms does not mean the absence of God. Even though the disciples were having to go through a storm, they were faced with a storm, Jesus was right there in the boat with them. He was right there with them in the middle of the storm. And a lot of times we think that if we're going through storms, that means that God has abandoned us, that God is absent in the storm, that just because we face storms, that means that God has left us, that His presence is no longer with us. But that's not true. God is with us in the storms, especially in the storm. God is always there with us. And so when we face storms in our lives and we feel like God may be absent, we need to trust in God's presence. We need to trust that He is with us, because God will never abandon us, He will never leave us, and He will never desert us. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 5 says, "For He Himself has said, I will never leave you nor abandon you." So the presence of storms does not mean the absence of God. Fourth, we need to seek Jesus in the midst of the storm. Seek Jesus in the midst of the storm. Whenever the disciples are faced with this storm, whenever this storm hits them, the first thing they do is they run to Jesus and wake Him up. They go to Jesus. They went to Jesus first. And when we go through storms in our life, do we go to Jesus first? I know a lot of times I fail to do that. A lot of times we as humans, when we are faced with a storm, we like to try to fix things ourselves. We like to take it upon ourselves and rely on ourselves to get things fixed. But that doesn't always work. And a lot of times we fail. And then we turn to others. We try to rely on other people, like our friends and our family and our mentors. And a lot of times that fails too. So instead of doing all that and trying to rely on ourselves, we need to learn to go to Jesus first. We need to seek Him first in the midst of a storm. And see, storms help us realize our need for Jesus. Storms help us to realize just how dependent we truly are on Him. And so whenever we experience a storm, we need to run back to Jesus. We need to go to Jesus first, because Jesus is the source of peace in the storm. So we need to make sure that we seek Jesus in the midst of the storm. Fifth, God's silence during the storm does not mean He does not care. See, Jesus is sleeping, so it appears like He doesn't care. And in fact, the disciples asked Him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" Jesus was asleep during the storm. He wasn't worried about the storm. He wasn't worried because He knew He was in control of it. And we'll get to that in a minute. But the disciples, they mistakenly thought that Jesus didn't care because He was silent. But that's not the case. And a lot of times we think that when storms hit us, if God doesn't speak or move in our lives, if God doesn't help us and deliver us immediately from the storm, we think that He's not there. And we think that He mistakenly think that He doesn't care. And a lot of times we ask ourselves these questions, and we question God. Why is God letting this happen? Why did God allow this storm in my life? If God cares about me, why isn't He helping me? Why isn't He delivering me? And we all have these feelings at times. But when God is silent during the storm, when we can't hear God's voice during the storm, we need to trust in God's character and know that God loves us and cares for us very deeply. He will not keep us in a storm without a purpose. There's always a purpose for the storm. And it's always for our best. He always has our best interest in mind. So just because God's silent, that doesn't mean He doesn't care. He cares about us, especially during hard times. Sixth, we see that Jesus is always in control of the storm. Jesus was sleeping. He wasn't worried about the storm because He knew He was in control. But we see the disciples, they weren't quite sure. They didn't have as much faith. And so they went to Jesus. And so Jesus stood up. He rebuked the wind, and so the wind ceased, and the storm calmed, and the sea was calm. And so Jesus showed that He is bigger and more powerful than any storm in our lives. No matter what we're facing, we can rest assured that Jesus is bigger and more powerful than that. He has everything in control. Nothing can touch us unless it goes through Jesus first. So Jesus is in control, and He will calm the storm in our life. There's no reason for us to fear because Jesus is in charge. We need to make sure that we focus on Jesus instead of the storm, because Jesus has the storm under control. Seventh, we see that storms strengthen our faith by testing our faith. Storms strengthen our faith by testing our faith. We see that Jesus asked the disciples, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" So we see that the purpose of this storm was to test the faith of the disciples, to see how much faith they had, and then also to increase their faith. And we see that the disciples, they did have some faith because they immediately went to Jesus for help. So they did have some faith, but they needed more faith. Their faith wasn't as strong as it should have been. But we see that after Jesus calmed the sea, after He calmed the storm, we see that the disciples are in awe and they have more faith in Jesus. They believe in Jesus. They're amazed by what He has done. And so going through this storm has increased their faith. And so a lot of times we go through storms in order to test our faith. And then when we can look back on the times when God has delivered us, we can look back on that and grow in our faith. And as God delivers us from storms, it increases our faith. And it helps us in the future to have faith because we can look back and see all the times in the past when God has come through for us. And that increases our faith. And so a lot of times the purpose of storms is to build our faith while testing it. To build our faith by removing fear and doubt from our hearts and minds. And we see in James chapter 1 verse 3, "Because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance." So the storm does have a purpose. And so today I'd like to end with a little bit of comfort, a comforting fact at the end of this story. And we see the story continues on into chapter 5. And it says, "They came to the other side of the sea." So Jesus kept them safe. And if Jesus is in our boat, we know that we will always reach our destination safely. We may go through some storms. We may go through some rough times. But Jesus is with us. He is in control. And He will get us to where He wants us to be, even if we have to go through a storm. So I pray today that Jesus is in your boat. I pray that you can look to Jesus to help you through whatever storm you're facing. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today. I pray that this message blessed you. Make sure to tune in next week for Tracy. I'm sure he's got another great message for us. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and God bless you.